A 170-kilometer long straight line cutting through the desert. 2 half-kilometer high walls running parallel to the horizon. No cars, no streets, no emissions, and 9 million people living within it. They called it the Line. I'm sure many of you remember it. And when Mohammed bin Salman unveiled it in 2021, they claimed it would rival Miami, Singapore, and Dubai as a hub for entertainment, culture, sports, and commerce. It would be one of the world's new capitals. Do you remember? I'm sure you do.
Designed by world-leading architects, the Line is 500 meters tall, 200 meters wide, 170 kilometers long, and housed within an elegant mirror glass facade.
And keep in mind that the Line wasn't the only mega project. It was merely the start of an entire constellation. There was also Trojana, a ski resort in the middle of the Saudi desert, where the 2029 Asian Winter Games were to be held. The Macabre, a 400-meter tall cubic skyscraper that was to be the centerpiece of the gleaming new Muraba district in Riyadh. Sindala, an ultra-exclusive resort on the island in the Red Sea. And beyond the Line lay the grand ambition of NEOM, a $500 billion mega project that Mohammed bin Salman promised would go public. VisualPolitik community, all these projects, which seem straight out of a science fiction movie, are, or were, part of Vision 2030, Mohammed bin Salman's plan to transform Saudi Arabia and wean its economy off its dependence on oil. We've spoken to you on more than one occasion about this plan, which emerged with the mission of achieving economic diversification, social modernization, and, in general, the construction of a more open, connected Saudi Arabia, capable of unleashing its potential. A project that, nevertheless, has gradually fallen apart. And now the war in Iran and the crisis in the Persian Gulf may have dealt it the final blow.
Exclusive. Saudi Arabia shelves Muqab the Cube project, world's largest skyscraper. 2029 Asian Winter Games in Saudi Arabia postponed.
And I say the final nail in the coffin, because the truth is that these problems are not new. In September 2025, the Saudi Public Investment Fund suspended construction of the Line until further notice. The drilling rigs and piling equipment were left stranded in the middle of the desert. The workers were laid off. And do you know how much of those 170 kilometers had been built? 2.4 kilometers. 1.4% of what was promised. The target population for the first phase dropped from 1.5 million residents to less than 300,000, and worse still, in November 2025, the Financial Times reported that the project's own architects had begun to doubt its viability. Costs had skyrocketed. Deadlines were being pushed back far beyond estimates, and the flood of foreign investment that Riyadh had expected to accompany government funding never materialized. Of course, this wasn't the only setback. Virtually all major Saudi megaprojects are struggling.
We have no ego. Absolutely no ego. If we announce something and we need to adjust it, accelerate it, and make it a priority over others, or defer or cancel it, we will without blinking.
But what on earth is going on? Why is the most ambitious and expensive plan on the planet falling apart? Well, it seems that in 2005 and 2006, Saudi Arabia already launched an economic cities program. And the truth is that the only project that was ever completed, King Abdullah Economic City, had tremendous difficulty attracting residents. Because political intentions are one thing, and market reality is quite another. Vision 2030 was explicitly designed to overcome those mistakes. But 10 years later, history is repeating itself. And the question is, why? Well, that's what we're going to tell you, because the most grandiose project ever designed is on the verge of collapsing, if it hasn't already. Along the way, Riyadh will have squandered tens of billions of dollars. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because the truth is, it hasn't all been failures. Look, when Mohammed bin Salman launched this mega plan in 2016, what he actually promised was to transform one of the most closed societies on the planet. And let's see, precisely in the social sphere, a good portion of the goals have been met. Saudi Arabia isn't the best country in the world when it comes to civil rights, but some things have improved. And that's evident in the data. For example, women's participation in the labour market has nearly doubled, from 19.7% in 2018 to 36.3% by early 2025, far exceeding the original target of 30%. Unemployment fell from 12.3% in 2016 to 7.2%, and tourism has reached 122 million visitors in 2025, surpassing its target of 100 million 7 years ahead of schedule. There are concerts and movie theatres, things that had been banned for 35 years, and these days we already see women and driving. Overall, it's something like a society that was frozen in time, but has begun to thaw at a speed that, by Gulf standards, is dizzying. Of course, in the desert of the Far East, nothing is what it seems. The real heart of Vision 2030 wasn't about Saudis being able to go to the movies. It was about ending their dependence on oil. In other words, to achieve the long-awaited economic transformation. But now, as you've seen, projects are being cancelled en masse. Why? Okay, some of you surely think this is mainly the fault of the war in Iran, which has brought everything to a halt. It's true, the war in Iran has been a major blow, probably something like the final nail in the coffin. The conflict has brought the Gulf's financial machinery to a halt.
How war hit the Gulf deal-making machine. Bankers had been on pace for $1 billion in deal fees for the first time in almost 20 years. Now everything is on ice.
Now, investment banking revenues in the region are plummeting. IPOs have ground to a halt. The euphoria in the markets has vanished. The flow of capital has stopped. And the sense of security has been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Just look at what happened with SABIC, the kingdom's largest industrial company and one largely owned by Aramco. Several Iranian missiles struck Jubail, the heart of Saudi Arabia's petrochemical industry, and the Arab industrial giant had to admit that it doesn't know when it will be able to resume production, and that, in any case, it will suffer substantial losses in 2026. Okay, obviously, all this has an impact, but it's surely just a temporary thing. No, that's not the reason. The line was already partially cancelled in 2024 and suspended in 2025. The IMF sounded the alarm back in July 2025 over the Saudi government's deficit. So no, the war is not the cause of Vision 2030. It has been a catalyst, but not the cause. The reason is the design of the plan itself. Pay attention. Saudi Arabia owns Aramco, the most profitable state-owned oil company on the planet, and virtually all the money for Vision 2030 comes, directly or indirectly, from there. As well as paying a ton of taxes and royalties, Aramco earns tens and tens of billions of dollars selling oil, more than $180 billion in 2025, and it distributes a good portion of those profits as dividends. And since the Saudi state controls most of the company, that money mostly ends up in the government's hands. In total, more than half of Saudi Arabia's budget revenue comes directly from Aramco. Obviously, this finances a large part of the government's spending, but it also does something else. It feeds the coffers of the PIF. What's the PIF? The Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which finances the Vision 2030 mega projects. This fund directly controls 16% of Aramco, which means it receives billions of dollars in dividends directly. In other words, the plan to stop relying on oil works thanks to oil itself. But the point is that the Saudi government likes to spend, and to spend lavishly, and its economy remains entirely dependent on oil. Well, here's the first problem. Over the past 2 years, oil prices haven't been booming, which has reduced revenue, leaving fewer resources available for investment. Put another way, Saudi Arabia needed money to invest in projects that would allow them to diversify their economy. Those projects don't generate money, and won't for a long time, so they need oil. Okay, so far so good. Second problem. Time is passing, and the results haven't materialized yet. The plan was called 2030, but it's now 2026. 10 years have passed, and little has been achieved, much less than expected. If Vision 2030 were working, Saudi Arabia would need less and less oil to sustain itself. However, the exact opposite is happening. It needs more and more. In fact, as time went on, two things became clear. The mega projects were becoming increasingly expensive and suffering from ever longer delays.
Saudi megacity Neom to cost almost $9 trillion, take over 50 years to build, internal audit warns.
And that's not the worst of it. To make matters worse, the third problem. The system created massive artificial accounting to justify all the expenses, starting with inflating forecasts and project timelines. More tourists, more residents, more revenue, more demand. The result? Money flowed with few restrictions. The numbers added up, so everything was going to be profitable, everything was perfect, and the accounting and projections became increasingly distorted. In the end, the hotel room that the initial plans estimated would generate $489 came to be expected to generate $1,800, and so it went with everything else. Expenses were rising, but so was the potential profitability. The result? Money kept flowing, even though the actual results were bad. Very bad. Consulting firms were raking in millions. Construction continued, money kept flowing, and the costs were swept under the rug. Well, you get the picture. The the more money was buried in the desert, the harder it was to admit that the venture might not be profitable. And it was the same in the desert as it was outside of it. To gain international visibility, the Sovereign Wealth Fund bought Newcastle United football team, launched LIV Golf to compete against the PGA Tour, snapped up Cristiano Ronaldo with a checkbook, tried to lure Messi, invested in Formula One, boxing, esports. Saudi Arabia was buying global visibility at a breakneck pace. And yes, they did manage to buy that visibility. The problem is that money isn't unlimited. Cost overruns meant more money was needed. Delays meant new revenue streams weren't coming in, and to top it all off, this happened. Look, the government's initial idea was to sell off stakes in Aramco on the market to finance its massive investments, to trade part of its oil wealth for a new diversified economy. But the IPO didn't go as planned. First, transparency issues meant that instead of listing it on an international stock exchange like London or New York, they ended up listing the shares on the Saudi Stock Exchange. The problem, that meant the bulk of the investors were Saudi. In other words, the government was raising money from its own cities, which were exposing their assets even more to oil. Do you see the paradox? But that wasn't the worst of it. To make matters worse, the Saudi oil company's IPO was met with a very cold reception. By early 2026, the stock price was 20% below its IPO price. In other words, selling new shares would have meant selling off the national treasure at a loss. The result, pressure on available funds skyrocketed, prompting Riyadh to become more demanding. And, of course, the numbers just didn't add up. Those in charge began to be fired, and NEOM gradually faded from official Saudi discourse. The problem? The same old flaws. The gigantic plan was nothing more than a collection of lavish projects decided in boardrooms that were far removed from reality. Pure planning. Almost like 5-year plans, but in a consulting firm version. What mattered was that the presentation be spectacular, not that it made sense. They thought money would make everything possible, but clearly that is not the case. Look, it's true that a lot of progress has been made. Theme parks, airlines, several resorts on the Red Sea, and metro lines in the capital have opened, and many real estate projects are transforming the country. The problem is the cost. VisualPolitik community on April 7th, they were prepared to present their new economic strategy, officially billed as a phase of maturity and more disciplined investment. But on that very same day, Iranian missiles struck Jubail, the heart of Saudi Arabia's petrochemical industry. And yes, oil prices have now skyrocketed, even though they're selling less oil. But the country risk has also risen, and capital has frozen. The result, Vision 2030, as it was designed, is proving to be a colossal failure. There will be progress, because a lot of money has been invested, but the waste has been colossal, which begs the question, was there no other way to do it? Well, the truth is, yes, and they only had to look to their neighbor.
The mirror Riyadh didn't want to look into.
30 years ago, Dubai was basically a desert port with some oil and few prospects. These days, with the exception of the war, it's the most important financial center between Europe and Asia, one of the world's most visited tourist destinations, as well as the logistics hub connecting 3 continents. And do you know how much oil accounts for in its economy today? 1.4% of GDP. In Saudi Arabia, by contrast, black gold still accounts for nearly 43% of GDP and around 75% of government revenue. Dubai managed to truly diversify its economy, and what's most interesting is how it did it. With a very clear logic that Saudi Arabia could have easily copied. Dubai didn't start by building spectacular buildings. It started by building institutions. The first thing they did was create free zones. Zones where foreign companies could operate with 100% ownership, without paying corporate taxes, with fewer bureaucratic hurdles, and with the guarantee of being able to take all their profits out of the country without restrictions. But that was only the beginning, because the smartest move was another one. Dubai quickly understood something that Riyadh has never wanted to understand. That major banks, investment funds, and multinationals would want much more freedom, flexibility, and legal certainty. Of course, they wouldn't invest if the territory were governed by Sharia law. In other words, they needed a much more international framework. special economic zones, advanced free zones with their own legislation, their own courts staffed by Westerners, with English as the official language and the dollar as the reference currency. The best example is the Dubai International Financial Centre, with its own legislation based on Anglo-Saxon common law, its own independent courts, operating in parallel with the rest of the Emirati legal system. In other words, they created a piece of London within their own territory, but modernised, with lower taxes and less bureaucracy. Did it work? Well,
Record 20th anniversary year. Results solidify DIFC's position as the region's #1 global financial center.
these days, this financial hub is home to some 7,700 active companies with nearly 48,000 professionals. By 2024, assets managed from there had skyrocketed to about $700 billion. And that's just one example. These evolved free zones, these special cities, have become one of Dubai's major engines. They account for nearly half of its companies and generate close to 40% of the Emirates' trade. In other words, pure institutional engineering. Massive mega projects aren't the secret to success. The rules are. You could say Dubai chose the rules, Saudi Arabia chose the glossy renderings. Why? Well, because the problem ceases to be economic and becomes political. Mohammed bin Salman wants to build his legitimacy around one idea, that of being the man who transformed the country. And above all, he wants power. And that clashes with what the market demands. Dubai's financial district works because there are relatively autonomous courts, predictable rules, and judges capable of ruling even against the state's own interests if the law requires it. That implies ceding some political control, and that is where the Saudi model hits its own limit. In a system so centralized around a few figures, where the entire narrative revolves around the leader's transformative vision, ceding institutional autonomy is far more difficult than building a skyscraper. That's why Saudi Arabia ended up gambling on concrete. Institutions are slow, technical, and boring. They don't appear in futuristic renderings, but they are exactly what turns an artificial economy into a real one. In any case, the cards have been reshuffled. The new flagship of Vision 2030 is no longer the line. Instead, it's Humane, an artificial intelligence company launched by the PIF in 2026 that aspires to become the region's leading technology player. According to the PIF's latest strategy for 2026 to 2030, Humane replaces the line as the flagship project. Where there used to be half-kilometer long mirrored walls, there are now data centers, AI infrastructure, and tech corridors. And let's face it, we have to admit that this time the argument has some real logic to it. Saudi Arabia has an objective advantage for hosting data centers. Extremely cheap energy. And state-of-the-art data centers are extraordinarily energy intensive. The idea is that if Saudi Arabia manages to attract AI infrastructure thanks to its energy costs, it could build something resembling a real tech ecosystem. All in all, the underlying problem remains the same. Data centers are not institutions. They are infrastructure. The state should create the conditions, not get bogged down in the projects. A data center doesn't create a capital market, doesn't attract international law firms, and doesn't generate a community of tech founders willing to stay. Anyway, only time will tell how this new venture turns out, and until then, the questions are over to you. Could Saudi Arabia build a real tech ecosystem without first building the institutions to support it? Or are we facing a new version of the same mistake with a different name? Leave your thoughts below in the comments, and let's start the discussion. And very importantly, if you liked this video, give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. These small gestures help us out a lot. And as always, thank you very much for being there. Take care. I'll see you next time.